5 years. That's how long I've been running Ember. 5 years of 12-hour shifts, of paying my staff before myself, of a loan I'm still paying back and a cold room that makes a noise I can't afford to fix. I've given this restaurant everything I have, and then found more to give. So when my brother sat across from me at a family dinner and casually told everyone at the table that he would never let his company associate with something as small as my place, and then smiled, and added that some people just aren't built for success, I want you to understand what I was sitting with for the 6 weeks that followed. And then I want to tell you what happened when his company accidentally booked their biggest corporate dinner of the year at Ember, without knowing for a single second that it belonged to me. The dinner table at my parents' house always felt like a stage. That Friday evening in early October, my brother Nate walked in 20 minutes late, loosened his tie like a man who had been saving the world, and dropped into the chair across from me without an apology. He smelled like expensive cologne and certainty. I had driven 45 minutes after a 12-hour shift at my restaurant, still carrying the faint smell of garlic butter on my hands, and I had arrived on time. Nobody noticed. My mother passed him the bread rolls. My father asked about his quarterly numbers. I was invisible. I was 38 years old and still felt like a child waiting to be called on. I poured myself a glass of water and reminded myself why I had come. Family dinner. 1 night a month. I could manage this. I watched Nate settle back with the particular ease of a man who has never once doubted his right to occupy a room, and I told myself to breathe. I had no idea that within the next 20 minutes, something would be said at that table that I would carry with me for months. Not because it broke me. Because it lit something inside me that I had let go dim for too long. It started the way his cruelties always did, wrapped in a joke, delivered with a grin. My mother asked how the restaurant was doing. I had an answer ready. October had been slow, but weekend brunch was improving. My sous chef, Priya, was testing a lamb chop for the winter menu that was extraordinary. I was about to say all of this when Nate cut across me. Still keeping that little roadside joint alive, Ro? He laughed like he had said something charming. Ro. Short for Rosalind. He had called me that since childhood, and somehow it always sounded diminishing. I set my fork down. It's a full-service restaurant with a wine list and a dining room that seats 60. He waved a hand like shooing a fly. I'd never let my company associate with something that small. Our clients expect a certain level. He looked around the table as if waiting for applause. My father nodded. My mother gave an uncertain smile. Then Nate, because one blow was never enough when two were available, leaned forward and added, "Some people just aren't built for success. It's not a flaw. Just reality." The table went quiet. I picked my fork back up. I smiled. Inside, something cracked straight down the middle. I drove home with the radio off. The silence felt necessary, like a room after something breaks and you need to listen for what else might fall. I parked behind the restaurant, let myself in through the back, and stood in my kitchen in the dark. The stainless steel counters caught the light from the street, and I breathed in the smell of the place. Rosemary. Lemon. The faint ghost of the last service. I had opened Ember 5 years ago with a loan I was still repaying, a second-hand convection oven, and a menu I had rewritten 40 times. I turned on the small lamp over the prep station and sat on a stool. The bills were in a folder on the corner shelf. I already knew what was inside them. A supplier had raised his prices. The cold room was making a noise that made Priya nervous. Weekend bookings were improving, but not yet where I needed them. I sat in my own kitchen and let myself feel it. Not the embarrassment of what Nate had said. The fear underneath it. What if he was right? What if this place I had poured everything into was too small to matter? I sat in the quiet dark and held that thought. I almost let it win. What stopped me was Mrs. Adiz. She was 71, came every Tuesday for the roasted chicken, and always sat at the corner table by the window. She had been coming since the month I opened. I remembered her walking in that first week, when the paint was still tacky and the menu was printed on paper I had cut myself. She ordered the chicken, ate it carefully, then asked to speak to the chef. When I came out still in my apron, she looked at me and said, "Young lady, this food tastes like somebody actually cared." She came back the next Tuesday. And the one after. One February evening during the worst winter in years, she stayed until closing. I brought her tea and sat with her for a while. She told me her husband had died 18 months before. That Ember was the only place she went where she didn't feel like a burden. "This place saved me during my worst days," she said. Sitting in my dark kitchen after Nate's dinner, I heard those words again. I pressed my palms flat on the cool prep counter and made a quiet decision. My restaurant was small. That was true. But what happened inside it was real. I was not giving Nate Delacroix the satisfaction of watching me shrink. 3 weeks after that dinner, on a Thursday morning in late October, an email arrived while I sat at my desk behind the kitchen. Subject line: Private Dining Inquiry, Corporate Event. I almost skimmed past it. We got occasional inquiries from local businesses, small groups dressed up in corporate language. But when I opened this one, I read it twice. Then a third time. The sender used a generic business email address and had not included a company name. What they had included was a proposed date in mid-November, a guest count of 40, and a budget per head that made me sit very still. More than 3 times my standard private dining rate. The email described a seated multi-course dinner, curated wine service, ambient decor, and a full room buyout. The attached figure was life-changing. Not retire and disappear money, but pay off the equipment loan, fix the cold room, hire a second server money. Real breathing room. I read it a 4th time. Then I wrote back. I said yes before I knew whose company it was, before I had studied the contract, before I had done anything except feel the particular relief that arrives when something you have been quietly hoping for finally shows up. I should have asked more questions first. I would later realize it didn't matter. The weeks that followed were the busiest I could remember since opening. The client sent a detailed brief, and I began to understand this was not an ordinary booking. The requests were specific in ways my usual clients never were. Printed menus, custom designed. A sommelier consultation. The room dressed in deep green and gold. The evening to feel, in their own words, like a world-class experience. I told myself this was simply a corporate client with deep pockets and high standards. I had worked in kitchens with far more demanding requirements before I ever opened Ember. But something in the detail of the requests sat oddly with me. The care about the room. The specificity about the flow of service. This didn't feel like a company that had stumbled across a small restaurant. It felt like someone who knew exactly what they were booking. I brought Priya into the planning and she immediately leaned over the notes like a woman who had been waiting for exactly this kind of challenge. "We can do this," she said. I believed her. I did. But as I drove home that night, the precision of those requests kept turning in my mind. Very specific people had booked this dinner. I just didn't yet know who they were. 10 days before the event, I got the call I had been dreading. My seafood supplier, a man named Bart who had been reliable for 4 years, called to say he was canceling my November orders. His own supplier had pulled out of a contract. He was sorry. 3 of my 6 courses featured seafood. 40 guests. A paid deposit. 10 days. Priya found me still sitting in the office 20 minutes later. I told her what had happened. She didn't panic. She pulled up a stool and said, "Okay, what do we do first?" We rebuilt the menu that night. Priya called a fishmonger she had worked with before. I contacted nearby farms about local proteins. By 9 o'clock we had a revised menu that was honestly better than the original. Tighter, more seasonal, more confident. The team heard about it the next morning. Our 2 servers, Kofi and Bet, said the same thing. They would work the extra prep days without additional pay. "Catch us up later," Kofi said, which was his way of saying he believed in what we were building. Standing in that kitchen with all 3 of them, I understood this dinner had already grown into something larger than a booking. It had become a proof. The week before the event, I opened my brother's social media during lunch. I rarely did this. Mostly I used it to post updates about Ember when I had time. But I had a habit of checking what Nate posted, the way you check a forecast when you suspect a storm might be forming. He had posted 3 times in the past week. The first was a photograph of himself at a conference. The second was a leadership quote I was certain he hadn't written himself. The third stopped me completely. Posted 2 days ago. Big news. Our team is celebrating a record quarter with an exclusive corporate dinner in November. Private venue. Top-tier experience. This is what we work for. In the comments, someone had asked for the date. He had answered. The date matched my booking exactly. I set my phone face down on the desk. My heart did something quick and strange. I told myself it was coincidence. Plenty of companies hosted dinners in November. The date alone meant nothing. I said this to myself twice more before admitting the truth. I needed to check the contract. I needed to check it right now carefully, before I talked myself any further into believing everything was fine. I pulled the booking contract from my desk drawer. The original inquiry had come through a generic email address, and the deposit had arrived by electronic transfer. But the formal contract, the one I had signed and returned, had a company name printed clearly at the top. I had processed it without looking the name up properly. I had been focused on the menu, the logistics, the numbers. The company name was Delacroix Consulting Group. I read it twice. Then I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Delacroix was not a common surname in this town. There was exactly one Delacroix with a consulting company. And I had eaten dinner across the table from him 6 weeks ago while he told everyone present that he would never associate his brand with something as small as my restaurant. I almost laughed. I almost cried. What I actually did was get up, walk to the kitchen sink, wash my hands out of pure habit, and stare at the wall above the soap dispenser. My brother, the man who had called Ember a struggling roadside joint, had booked his company's celebratory dinner here. He had absolutely no idea the restaurant belonged to me. I sat with this knowledge for a full day before deciding what to do. The easiest option was to cancel. Send back the deposit, cite a scheduling conflict, and remove myself from the situation. I drafted that email in my head at least a dozen times. But every time I got to clicking send, something stopped me. Not spite. Something quieter than spite. Canceling would solve nothing. It would not change what Nate had said. It would not pay my equipment loan or fix the cold room or prove anything, to anyone including myself, about what Ember was capable of. And my team. Kofi had already worked 2 unpaid prep days. Priya had restructured the entire menu from scratch and spent evenings testing sauces. Bet had sourced custom napkins from a personal contact. They had done all of this because they believed in the restaurant. Canceling would mean telling them we had stepped back from our one real opportunity, not because we couldn't deliver, but because I was afraid of my brother's face when he walked through the door. I was not afraid of his face. I made my decision. I would serve this dinner. Flawlessly. On my terms. And I would let the evening speak entirely for itself. With 8 days remaining, I made a decision I had never made before. I upgraded everything. Carefully and strategically, the way you lay tiles on a floor 40 people need to walk across and trust completely. I rented additional lighting, warm and low, the kind that makes a room feel designed for exactly how people want to feel at dinner. I ordered flowers, deep greenery, ivory blooms, touches of gold in tall vases. The tablecloths were linen and pressed. The place settings polished until they showed no watermarks. I reorganized the floor plan so the room breathed differently. More space between tables, a feeling of privacy and occasion throughout. I had a faded section near the window repainted. I hung a warm-toned piece by a local artist on the wall guests would face when seated. When Priya walked in on the 3rd day of setup, she stood in the doorway and said quietly, "I barely recognize this room." That was exactly the response I was hoping for. I wanted even people who had visited Ember before to feel they were somewhere new. Somewhere that expected something important to happen within it. The restaurant was ready. I was ready. Whatever expression crossed my brother's face when he walked through that door was going to be worth it. The evening of the dinner, the first car arrived at 6:58, 2 minutes before the stated arrival time, which told me these guests operated on strict schedules. I stood near the kitchen door, watching Kofi move through the room with the easy professionalism I had spent years helping him develop. Bet was at the entrance, calm and elegant. More cars arrived. I watched through the narrow glass panel as guests filtered in, polished, composed, the kind of people who move through rooms as if they have always belonged. They looked at the dining room and their expressions shifted. The slight widening of the eye. The small nod people make when a space exceeds what they expected. One woman in a burgundy blazer turned slowly and said something to her companion I couldn't hear, but I read it in her posture as a compliment. Then, near the back of the arriving group, Nate. He came through the door with colleagues, talking, relaxed. He glanced around the room. His expression changed. He stopped mid-sentence. His colleagues kept walking and he fell 2 steps behind. He was trying to locate himself. The layout. The windows. The Ember logo etched in the glass panel above the bar. He made the connection. I watched it happen. Then I stepped out. I walked across the room at a measured pace, the same pace I always used on the floor, and stopped in front of my brother. "Good evening," I said. "Welcome to Ember." The color left his face in stages, like a tide going out. His colleagues had already moved toward their seats. He stood frozen near the entrance. "This is," he started. He looked at the room. He looked at me. He tried again. "Your restaurant?" "Yes," I said simply. "It is." He stood very still for a moment. The easy confidence that had carried him through every room I had ever watched him enter was entirely gone. In its place was something I had never seen on Nate's face before, the particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the story he has been telling has finally caught up with him. Behind him, I could hear the warm hum of guests settling in, conversation starting, the evening already in motion. Inside the kitchen, Priya was running her first timing check. Kofi was moving through the room with welcome drinks. Everything was exactly as it should be. My brother was the only thing standing still in the whole restaurant. I gave him a moment. Then I excused myself and went back to work. I did not give Nate time to collect himself. The evening was not about him. It was about 40 guests who had come for dinner, and they were going to get the finest one I had ever produced. I signaled Kofi to begin the welcome drink service and the room filled with conversation and the soft clink of ice in glasses. The kitchen moved on schedule. Priya had drilled the timing so thoroughly that each course emerged as if it were effortless, which is the only way real effort ever looks from the outside. The first course was a parsnip velouté in a shot glass with a single fried caper. People made involuntary sounds when they tasted it. Good ones. The second course was seared duck breast over roasted plum and bitter leaf, and by the time Kofi cleared those plates, the room had settled into the particular warmth of a dinner that is genuinely going well. I moved through the space carefully, checking without hovering, adjusting without drawing attention. Every detail held. I caught Nate watching me twice from his end of the table. Both times he looked away. His colleagues were animated, leaning toward each other with the body language of people truly enjoying themselves. He was the only person in the room who looked uncomfortable. The shift happened midway through the third course. I was at the service station near the bar when I heard it. A voice, male, confident, carrying across the room with natural authority. Extraordinary place. The man speaking sat 2 chairs from Nate, silver-haired, heavyset, with the bearing of someone accustomed to making large decisions. Based on the seating chart the events coordinator had sent, this was Ferris, the company's managing partner. The man Nate had spent years trying to impress. "Whoever sourced this venue did exceptional work," Ferris said, then turned toward Nate with a warm, expectant look. "Why didn't you mention your family owned a place like this? You've been hiding something impressive." The table laughed. Nate laughed too, but it was the wrong kind. Too fast, too high, like a sound that escaped before he could catch it. He reached for his wine glass. I watched from across the room as he searched for an answer true enough to survive but vague enough to protect him. "Just wanted the venue to speak for itself," he said finally. Ferris nodded, satisfied. But I could see it in the tension around Nate's jaw. He was already losing his grip on the story he had been telling about me for years. He found me near the end of the 5th course. I was in the narrow hallway between the dining room and the kitchen, writing on my service clipboard. I heard him before I saw him. Footsteps approaching a conversation someone isn't certain they should be having. "Ro." His voice was lower than it had been all evening. I turned. He had the expression of a man who has several things to say and cannot decide which one costs him least. I didn't know it was your place, he said. I know. The booking went through our events coordinator. She found it online. By the time I connected the address, the deposit was already paid, Nate. I said his name simply. You don't need to explain the logistics. He stopped, pushed a hand through his hair. I just don't want this to become a thing tonight. I almost smiled. It isn't a thing. I'm running a dinner. My team has been extraordinary. The food is excellent. Your guests are happy. He nodded slowly. They really are, he admitted. I know, I said. Because this restaurant is good. It always was. Even when you couldn't see it. I held his gaze. Some people aren't built for success, Nate. But I am. Then I walked back into my kitchen. I stood at the pass for a full minute after that. Priya glanced at me once, read something in my face, and said nothing. That is the gift of someone who truly knows you, knowing when to leave a person alone with what they are feeling. She plated the next course with the same precision she had brought all evening, and I walked back onto the floor and did my job. But inside, something had settled. Not loudly. More like a door closing gently on a room you have walked through your whole life, finally choosing to leave it. My brother's opinion had taken up so much space for so long. The weight of his dismissal. My parents' quiet agreement. The feeling of being too small in rooms where others seemed to take up exactly the right amount. I had let it make me doubt things that did not deserve doubting. Standing on this floor tonight, watching 40 people experience something my team had built from a cancelled supplier, a borrowed fishmonger, and a cold room making a bad noise, I knew what I knew. I had done this. It was real. No one's inability to see it had ever made it less so. I felt, for the first time in a long time, completely proud. The dessert course ended and the room loosened in the natural way of a good dinner's close. Chairs pushed back slightly, hands wrapped around coffee cups, voices rising a note or two. I was heading toward the bar to check the digestive service when Ferris stood up. He was the kind of man whose standing caused others to notice. The nearest table quieted first, then the ripple moved outward until most of the room was paying attention without quite meaning to. He raised his glass. I assumed he was going to toast the quarter, or the team, or Nate's leadership. Instead he looked directly across the room at me, standing near the bar. Before we close this evening, I want to acknowledge the person responsible for this experience. A pause. The owner of this restaurant, who built something remarkable here and ran tonight with the kind of quiet excellence that doesn't need to announce itself. The room went warm and still. Ferris said, I'd like to hear how you built this place. If you're willing. I looked at the room. 40 people turned toward me. My brother at the far end of the table, very still. I set down my clipboard. I walked to the center of the floor. The room waited. I told them the truth. Not all of it, not the family dinner, not the roadside joint comment, not the 6 weeks of carrying something cracked inside me. I told them the part that mattered in a room full of people who had each chosen a difficult thing. I said I had opened Ember 5 years ago with more debt than savings and more belief than certainty. That the first year was the kind of difficult that doesn't translate unless you've lived it. That I kept going because I believed, not theoretically, but in my hands and decisions every single day, that this restaurant had something real to offer. I told them about the woman who came every Tuesday and said the food tasted like somebody cared. About this very week, the supplier who cancelled 10 days out, the team who rebuilt the menu overnight, the 2 servers who worked extra days without asking to be paid first. That tonight's dinner had almost not happened. And that it happened anyway, because the people in my kitchen refused to let it not. I did not mention my brother. At the far end of the table, Nate was looking at the tablecloth. When I finished, the room was completely quiet. Thanked them briefly, professionally, and tried to redirect toward whether anyone needed anything before the evening closed. But Ferris wasn't finished. He leaned toward me and said, in a voice the surrounding tables could still hear, we host 5 corporate events per year. Dinners, client evenings, team celebrations. We've been using the same hotel ballroom for 4 years because no one thought to look elsewhere. A pause. I'd like to discuss a standing arrangement. Quarterly, at minimum. Perhaps more. I kept my expression steady. I'd be glad to discuss that, I said. At the end of the table, Nate's managing partner, the man Nate had spent years trying to impress, had just offered Nate's sister a long-term partnership. In her restaurant. On her terms. I watched Nate's colleague lean over and say something to him. Nate smiled and nodded. But I had known my brother's real smile since childhood, and that was not it. His standing in the room had not vanished dramatically. It had faded, like light at the end of an afternoon, and then, without transition, gone. Guests began leaving close to 10 o'clock. Several stopped to thank me personally at the door. 2 exchanged cards with Bet, asking about private bookings. Ferris shook my hand and said his coordinator would call the following week. I stood at the entrance and received all of it with the stillness of someone very full who does not want to spill. Nate was among the last to leave. He passed me at the door with his coat over his arm and stopped. His colleagues had already moved ahead toward the cars. Just the two of us briefly in the doorway. He looked at me without speaking. I waited. Your team was excellent tonight, he said finally. It was not an apology. It was not a retraction of a single word he had said at my parents' table. But it was Nate Delacroix saying, out loud and to my face, that something I had built was excellent. I understood it for what it was, as much as he could offer that night. Thank you, I said. They are. I held the door open. He walked out. 3 colleagues waited by the cars, and I heard one of them ask him clearly, why have you never mentioned your sister's restaurant? I let the door close. Kofi locked the front door at 10:15. Priya was in the kitchen breaking down the stations with the satisfaction of someone who has done a hard thing well. Bet was rolling napkins into the laundry bag, humming something I couldn't name. I walked the dining room once, slowly. Glasses half cleared. Flowers still holding their shape. Faint ring marks on the tablecloths that would wash clean tomorrow. The room looked exactly as rooms look at the end of the best nights, used warmly, the way good things are meant to be used. I sat at a cleared table near the window and placed my hands flat on the surface. The cold room was still making its noise. The equipment loan was still in a folder on my office shelf. Tomorrow would bring the usual problems that running a small restaurant requires. None of that had changed. But something had. Not in the walls or the menu or the bones of the place. It had changed in the way things change when they are finally seen clearly by the people who needed to see them. Ember had met the highest night it had ever been asked for, and it had risen without apology. I sat with that for a while before going to help with the kitchen. The weeks after the dinner moved differently. My mother called on a Tuesday, not our usual monthly catch-up. Just to talk. She asked how the event had gone. Someone had told her, probably one of Nate's colleagues. I said it had gone well. She said she was proud of me. That word sat strangely between us, because she had never quite used it that way about Ember before. She had always been supportive in the careful way parents support things they don't fully understand. This was different. More specific. More seeing. My father called 2 days later and asked if he could come to dinner the following weekend. Not for any occasion. Just to come. He sat at the corner table, ate the duck breast and the lamb chops and the chocolate tart, and at the end said quietly, "This is really something, Rosalind." Not Rosalind. My full name, the way he said it when I was small and he wanted me to remember something. I knew the pride was real. I also knew it had arrived late, through someone else's door. I saw that clearly. I was not bitter. I simply saw it, the way you see things clearly when you are finally standing in the right light. By December, Ember had 3 confirmed corporate bookings for the following quarter, all from contacts made at the Delacroix dinner. Ferris's coordinator called as promised, and we negotiated a standing arrangement that covered half my equipment loan in the first payment. I fixed the cold room. I hired a part-time pastry chef. I replaced the dining chairs with ones that didn't creak. Small things. Necessary things. The restaurant looked exactly like itself, only clearer. Priya designed a tasting menu for January. I repainted the sign above the entrance in a deeper shade, because this place deserved its name to be readable from the street. Mrs. Adiz came in on the first Tuesday of the new year, ordered the chicken, and when I brought it out myself, she said, "You seem different." I thought about it. I think I stopped apologizing for this place, I said. She picked up her fork. Good. It was never owed. Nate and I spoke at Christmas, briefly, as always. Neither of us mentioned the dinner. But something between us had shifted in the permanent way things shift when truth is spoken with witnesses. He had mocked my small restaurant. Then his company came to it. And the room that had always been mine became the place that showed everyone exactly who was built for this.